And a 5 and a 6 and a 7 and an 8. I feel like I'm going to start mixing it up. I'm going to start doing like and a 1 and a 2 and
You can even change the numbers. I love it. Okay.
Listen, the numbers work
Every week.
interchangeably.
Yep. Okay,
Yep.
cool.
It's just whatever we're vibing.
Keep me on my toes.
Yeah, that's right. And for all of you people that are confused about joining a PR podcast and having a listen in, and then you've entered a accounting podcast, don't worry, because this is the Smart and Public podcast where we talk about business and careers and life all through the eyes of PR people and communications experts. So welcome. Welcome to our podcast.
I'm Katie Duffy.
And I'm Katie Boyson. Duffy, today we've got a really good topic. I am really excited to share this with everybody. And it's about building and managing global comms teams. And this is one near and dear to our heart. Obviously, I worked at a headquarters in the US and then went back to Australia. Duffy was the leader in market for APAC for a company that had to work with HQ and kind of manage her own team on the ground across different time zones and countries and continents and all of that good stuff. So we're really excited to kind of share our experiences and best practices and lessons learned on how to help people identify when it's good to hire a comms person in a region, how you pick an agency, all the ins and outs of managing your executives overseas and all that good stuff. So we're gonna have a real meaty one today.
This is a good one. I feel like we have a good, between the two of us, really good different experiences, but good stuff that we can add to the conversation.
I think so too. Lots of lessons learned for me, especially being the American that moved over to Australia, and then I was like, "Wait, what's happening?"
Definitely lessons learned on the comm side, but also just generally culturally lessons learned.
Oh my God! Well, how long is the dumb and private session? If I can just do a whole Australian learning dumb and private at the end,
that's just the whole theme of the episode.
Exactly. Well, before we dive into that, Duffy, how's your week been? Tell me everything about your life.
No, it's been good. Andrew's away this week, so I'm solo parenting, but like I feel like I'm nailing it. Like the kids are alive, they're thriving, so yay me.
You haven't forgotten the stroller anywhere?
No, nope. The pram is accounted for, children are accounted for. It's working this week, so I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I had friends in town from Denver this last weekend, so. I think I talked about this a little bit last time on the pod, but we got tickets to see Crowded House at the amphitheater locally here in Bend. It was amazing. I was having a little bit of an embarrassed moment. I don't know if it's like that secondhand embarrassment for Crowded House because they are amazing and they're like gods in Australia. And the last time that I saw them, I was in Sydney at a Fleetwood Mac concert, and Neil Finn, the singer of Crowded House, was subbing in for Lindsey Buckingham. And so Stevie Nicks and Neil Finn ended up singing Don't Dream It's Over in a duet on stage, and it was like one of the most magical moments of my life. And then we go to see Crowded House in the amphitheater here, and it holds 8,000 people. It's not huge, but it's significant. And there were probably 1,000 people. It was empty. It was bare as, and I was like, oh man, they're just not getting the love that they deserve here. Like, how weird to go from 3 sold out shows probably in Australia, like back to back, to coming to Bend and it's, a bunch of old farts and then me dancing around in the background to something so strong.
Yeah, I guess. What do you call yourselves? Bendonians? I don't know. I guess they're just not fans of Crowded House. It's a long way to like travel, like.
I know. I do have to say that Neil Finn still rocks the like mohawk rocker hair, and that was impressive for me.
They're amazing. Good on you guys for going. I feel like they are so good. And yeah, it's nice to just have a little bit of like, you had that experience in Sydney and now you're doing it in Bend. Love it.
Yeah. No, it was good. Okay, you ready for the topic? So building and managing global comms teams is more than just finding the right people overseas. It's about understanding the market, storytelling nuances, the cultural differences, identifying key publications and journalists, and building trust within your international team members so that they can then localize your global messaging with impact. So I think one way that we could probably start this off if you are a person at headquarters and you're thinking about going somewhere in market, like how do you know it's the right time to hire somebody in market? Like, is it in-house? Is it an agency? What are your thoughts on that, Dovesy? Just kind of kicking us off.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think it depends on so much about the business and the goals of the business and where that business is at in relation to each of those markets. But I think some of the things to think about, there's probably two key questions in terms of, and we'll get to agency versus an in-house person, but I think in general, are you trying to create a market or are you waiting for a maturity level where the business is at in that market, where maybe you have more issues cropping up in that market? Maybe your employee base has got quite large, and so there's an element of internal, but also that risk element of having a larger employee base means that things might be a little bit more risky externally. So I think it's about going, where is the business at? I think from a revenue perspective, like, is that market a key market from a revenue perspective, and or will it be? And one of the things we used to look at my old company is TAM, right? So total addressable market. And that was looking at, well, what is the possible growth in that market? And I think, some markets you could see there'd be a huge TAM. So you may not be there yet, but actually there's all this addressable market you need to go get. And that's kind of to that creating the market is like, well, maybe you need a PR person in there to start kind of working with the journalist, getting the story out there because there's revenue that you could be go getting. So I think it's a partnership with the business. I think it's about looking at the maturity of your comms organization, but also the maturity of the business, and then looking at a few of those factors to say, like, are we at that level or do we want to go and create this market? And then that's when you might start to look at, okay, who's right to do that? An agency, and maybe we first start with an agency, or do we actually need someone on the ground in the business who's living and breathing it, who we trust, who's probably a little bit more senior than what you might get if you just had an agency? So I think those are the types of questions people need to be asking.
Yeah, and it probably also matters based on that TAM, like how big of a priority is that market? And then you probably would want to find somebody in-house down on the ground. Because just in my experience as well, being on the regional side, not the headquarters side, there are dangers in the market of companies hiring an agency on the ground, but then the guidance that they're getting is from a headquarters person who doesn't understand that market and is just kind of sending off templates, or this is the way that things are done, or you need to stick to this key messaging, or here's our customers, and maybe they're not the right customers. And the agency, not knocking on agency, but the agencies will then likely just take that and run, and you probably won't get the right messaging, or things won't land as well because you don't have that pure localization and that kind of foot on the ground.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing with agencies, often I think it's easy for people to get budget. It's harder to get headcount. And so I think often people might lead with an agency because they might be able to get, a small retainer from their global budget to put to that market. One of the things I would say, if that's what you've got, like you don't have a headcount and you're not going to have a headcount for a little while, but you do need to do something in the market, I think thinking about who is a really good local agency, maybe more of a boutique, who has really good local expertise. And it's not to say that the big global ones don't. I think a lot of them do. They have really good local teams. But I sometimes find if that's where you're at, if you've only got budget for an agency and it's a small budget, if you had heaps of budget, maybe different story. But if it's a small budget, I think a boutique can be a really good option. They can often give a little bit more time to the client. You might get a really senior resource within that agency working on your account, in which case they're kind of the quote unquote in-house person, if you can swing it that way. But I think as you mature and as those markets get bigger, having someone in the business is really important, I think.
Yeah. What would you recommend people look for if they're looking to hire an in-house person in region?
So this is my personal opinion. Caveat that because people might disagree, and I don't want to. You'll know what I'm talking about when I say it, but I don't want to shit on expats, I guess. But my personal opinion is you need to hire someone who's from that market. And what I mean by that is someone who's lived a significant amount of time in that market. Maybe they're an expat, but they've been there 15 years, 20 years, whatever it might be. I still think like someone who's born in that market, has lived through that cultural environment, understands the political landscape. And it's not just about the media, it's like the cultural nuance that comes with that market.
Mhm.
And so my personal feeling is you look for someone like that. Then there's kind of all the comm skills that you need. But I think in general, if it's going to be a single hire, a single operator, individual contributor, you need someone who's at a fairly senior level, mid to senior, not necessarily massively senior, but I don't think you want someone who's junior, because I think that person is going to need to make some decisions with the local business. They're going to have to sit in rooms with senior executives from that local business. So I think you want to have to think about that mid-level seniority. And then can that person operate fairly independently, but with a nature that is good gut checking? You know, when do I need to check with HQ? When do I need to validate this with a global message? But they're going to have to operate fairly independently. So I'd be looking for that skill set alongside all the kind of traditional comms skill sets. But those are the kind of things I've looked for, is someone who I can go, do you know what? Like, and I'll give you a good example. I hired the most amazing person in India, and she's still there today at Salesforce. Shout out to Rashika. But what I looked for in that role was, I knew I was not going to be able to get there very often. And I still did go, but I knew that's a long way to travel. There's a lot of, I'm in Australia, it's a fair way to go. So I just knew that wasn't going to be something that I could do really, really frequently. So I really needed someone who understood the market, who could tell me when what we were doing was not going to work, but who also knew when to check with me. And I think in some markets, that's really important, is like that balance of like, hey, this doesn't quite feel right, and the local business is going to go and do it, and I'm going to go and gut check it. And she was really good at that, but then I could let her run with things outside of that. So that's what I look for when I was hiring.
I do think on the expat kind of thing as well, based on my own experience in coming over, when I went over to Australia, I probably like 12 years of experience in PR, maybe 10. So from a process perspective, and like knowing how to work with executives and knowing how to get under the hood of a business and how to write and when to pitch and all of that, I totally understood that. And I'm all for skills are transferable. So if you work in the tech industry, why not work in the airline industry? Like you can make that work. There's something nuanced about having to move to another country and really understand what the importance is, like what's the national agenda, like what's really driving news right now, what type of customers do people like to hear from, and then just also understanding all those little bits in between that really takes a local experience and a really, really good knowledge of the market that takes time.
Yeah. And you know what? Let me caveat what I said as well, because you've raised a good point. I think when you're going to have one person in a market, it's really important that, for me personally, that person kind of is embedded in that market, understands it, is from that market. When you start to grow your teams in the different markets, then I'm less worried, right? And a good example is you coming across to our team actually brought us a lot of insight into HQ that we maybe didn't have sitting in region. And sometimes in region, you have a little bit of I don't want to say bitch, but maybe a vent about HQ and like what they're doing. And I'm sure they do the same with the regions, but you have those moments. But I think that cross learning of having someone who'd sat in HQ, who got that motion and that kind of vibe, I guess, and then to come and sit and be in our team, although you had a lot of learning to do on the Australian cultural side, I feel like you added a lot to our team from that perspective. So I think once you start to grow a little bit, having a mix of where people have been, what countries they've lived in, is a great thing. Like, that's a really good thing. I think it's just, if you were having that one first hire for a market, I would probably aim for someone from that market.
In terms of, you've got your team, say you've got your agency, one of the biggest things that I think is also one of the most complex as that next step is kind of managing those teams in different time zones. So I've got some ideas, but keen to hear, like, where does that work and where does that break from your side when you're managing those regional teams?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things for me. Well, first of all, I think know the time zones. And I know that.
Let's start from the top.
Let's start right there. And I know that sounds really silly, but I can't tell you the amount of times I've had to explain to people that I am on a different time zone. And I just would encourage anyone who's in another market working with other markets, and I say this for Australia too, right? But wherever you are, if you're going to have team members in another market and you're going to be engaging with them, like, understand what time zone they're on, right? when are you booking a call? And it doesn't matter if that call has to be early morning. Like, I think that's part of the nature of global comms. But saying something like, hey, I know this is really early for you. I'll record it in case you're doing drop off or whatever. Or I'd love you to be there. Just someone saying that to me was like, oh, wow, they get it. Like, they've booked a call right in the middle of my, breakfast with the kids or whatever it is. And 9 times out of 10, I can make that call because I've managed my life to do that. And that's the position I'm in. But I just start there because I think there's been many, many times where people have booked calls with me at like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. And I'm like, hey, this is 3 a.m. for me. Like, do you think we could move it? And it's like just that kind of non-awareness. So I think that's like number one for me. And likewise, when I had team members, I tried really hard not to book things at weird times. Yeah. And if I did, I always called it out. And I think COVID helped us in the sense that we all learned to record calls. We all got better with video calls. So I do think that has helped us from a regional team perspective. My second thing is I really do believe you've got to go to the market if you've not been there. So if you're coaching people, working with people in a different market, if you've never been to that market, I just don't think that shows that you understand their context. Mm-hmm. I know it's not possible all the time. Budgets are tight, all that sort of stuff. But I fought really hard at times to get budget to go see team members. And I always built it around something like a business event or what we were doing where I could support and help that team member with something, right? So it wasn't just me going there. But I can't tell you how much that helped my cultural knowledge to go and spend a week, just sit in the office, hear the office conversation, hear how the executives engage, go out to dinner, whatever it might be, right? And see the environment for what it is, particularly in markets that are developing nations. I think that's really important. For me, my first visit to India was quite confronting, but it's important, right? And it's going to be it is an incredible market. It's a growing economy. It's going to be a superpower. And I think if you're going to manage India, you need to go and experience India and understand it and spend time with your team there. So that's a big one for me. I don't know. What about you?
I think that's definitely a huge part of it. And kind of when you're a manager, you get what you put into it. And I think having time with your employees is really important. I think a tip for people that are thinking about how to justify a trip to go in market and see what it's like on the ground is if there's an event and there's any kind of media there, there's your opportunity. So we really got a lot of opportunities in our last roles to be able to go to Hong Kong and Singapore and India because of the events that were there and the media that were there. And that was also really helpful, not because you just get to see how the marketing team is running the event, what the cultural nuances are at the event as well, but you get to meet the journalists in person as well. And a lot of the times before you make that hire internally or you have the agency on the ground, you're really just living over email with these journalists and it's a very transactional setting. But getting there on the ground and getting to actually meet them and have them kind of in your house at your event and show off all of the great execs and like products and things like that, it really, really helps.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it's a really good point that it can be very transactional with team members too, quite frankly, if you've never met them in person and you're kind of, coaching them. I think if you haven't done that, I've figured out a way to make it work. I think it can be hard. It can be done. I've definitely done it. I've definitely managed people that I haven't had a chance to get to the market. A couple of those times have been when I've been like late in my pregnancies and I can't travel and then I've hired someone and then I go off on mat leave and then you realize, oh my gosh, I've been working with this person for like a year and a half and I haven't seen them, but it's been a big thing to me to go, so I've got to get over there whenever I can. So that's a really big one for me, I think. And then I think we talked about trust. I just want to touch on that and maybe we can talk a little bit about like the regional global trust, but also trust in team members. I think, in our managing episode where we talked about, how to be good managers and whether comms people make good managers, I think there's kind of a really important element of like trusting these people that you hire because they do know their markets. And sometimes it's this fine balance between your gut where you do know you need to step in and say, actually, that's not going to work and here's why I think it's not going to work. But then understanding when it is an element of culture and when it isn't something that is going to change or a style that isn't going to change. And, different journalists in different markets have different styles. And we sometimes got pushback from a HQ, executive or whoever it might be on certain journalists or styles. And some of that is like never going to change. That is the the nature of the journalists of that market. So I think it's just understanding when your team member says to you, actually, that's just how they are. That's really normal. That's not, you just have to trust that and go, yeah, okay, I'm going to go to bat for you and back you up on that. So I do think it's really important that you trust it.
I agree. I think one thing that you can also do to manage that is, say you have an HQ executive that's come into region and they're going to interview with a journalist from your region. One of the things that you can do is brief your executive on that journalist style. So they typically sit really silent in an interview and just let you talk, or they're going to probably ask 3 questions. So it's up to you to tell the story. So really briefing your executive and whoever that executive's handler HQ to understand those cultural nuances is so important.
We also used to build into briefing docs, and I'm sure everyone does this, so maybe this isn't rocket science, but I'll share it anyway in case it helps. We used to build in like a section that was sort of like a cultural context of the market, right? So it didn't really have anything to do with technology or, there was a loose link, but in general, it was like, okay, so this is the market, here's who's in government, here's the current kind of national agenda. In the next week, it's going to be Chinese New Year. And what does that mean? And what does that look like in terms of, and just those types of things where it's like, so an executive visiting wasn't just getting, here's your talking points for this interview for this market. And that's important too, because you need proof points from the market, all that sort of stuff. But we liked to layer in that stuff. Some of them read it, some of them didn't, I don't know. But like, I do think trying to kind of give your executive that whole rounded view of a market as much as you can in a document, like you're never going to fully do it. But I do think that's helpful. And I know some executives used to say to us, oh, I didn't even know that, thanks for adding that in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that element is so important also if there's some kind of incident or moment happening in the market where a lot of the times the journalists, if you have an executive come from overseas and they're speaking to the local market, they want to know what's your opinion on XYZ that's happening. Just assuming because it's big news to them that other people know. And that goes the same for when you're in region, you come to HQ, like you need to make sure that the national agenda and the things that are really happening in the market are brought into that conversation and teach your exec either how to bridge away from it if we don't want to touch it, or relate it to a story or to something that is culturally relevant for how they blend it in.
And some messages, I'll give you an example. Quality messaging was really big at Salesforce, right? And we did a lot of things globally in different markets to stand up for, the rights of different minority groups, which was incredible. It was one of my favorite things to actually work on at Salesforce in the external market. But that message in different markets lands very differently. And that's, a kind of really strong equality message in a market like Singapore or in India is different. And there are different levers to pull, right? Like we have done some incredible work in India with a return to work program for women. And it has landed so well and it's an amazing story. And then there's stuff that we haven't necessarily gone super hard on, and same in Singapore. And it's not to say that you should shy away from your values. Absolutely not. We never did. But it just giving executives that cultural nuance was really important because I think the way that you position it, the way that you talk about it is slightly different. And that's just the nature of the market. And I think that made some people uncomfortable that they couldn't maybe say it exactly the way that they would say it in another market. But there are things to be aware of in the way that our staff operate in that market, in the way that they, all of that stuff. So I just think that was a good example of where we didn't change the message. We still absolutely stood for equality on a number of different areas, but we maybe changed the way that we delivered that message when we're in certain markets.
Let me share a nightmare story of where that fell down for me at one point. We were announcing our parental leave extension, and that was a big deal because it was across APAC and it was a ton of time and it was super supportive for parents. A piece of that was messaging around surrogacy and being able to are you just dying knowing the story I'm about to tell? So it was about surrogacy. And in India, there are laws around the ability to have a surrogate who is from another country and bring the baby back overseas. And we were talking to this journalist who brought that up and was like, so are you supporting, surrogacy and bringing Indian babies back into Australia, which is technically illegal? But it caught me by surprise because I wasn't expecting her to talk about India and what that looked like. And then also because I hadn't properly briefed my executive on that scenario because I just hadn't thought about it coming up. Maybe it was inexperience, maybe it was a complete oversight, but I ended up having to jump in and bridge away and kind of get the journalist back on track in that interview. And the poor executive, it was her very first interview that she'd ever done. Oh, I traumatized her, but it's just so important to think about all those different angles and ask questions. Like, it is okay to not know everything and to bring in other team members from different countries to help brief your executive. You don't have to be the star in that prep session. And I learned so many lessons in 15 minutes on that call.
I think the other, like, I think the crux of that was, which was an interesting one, right, is the journalist was essentially saying, we're supporting women to buy babies, I think was kind of the gist, which was in no way what we were doing. But the other thread of some of that stuff, which was always an interesting one, was around, like, providing all these benefits to women, like supporting the cost for egg freezing, that kind of thing. And I also had another one that was like, and we're going a little bit off tangent here, but I think I'll circle it back to what we're talking about.
It's my fault.
It's about women. Like, are we providing these benefits so that women stay in the workforce longer, and don't go out and have babies? Essentially, like, they can freeze their eggs and then they can keep. And I was like, I had not even thought of that, because I know so many people who egg freezing is really an important option for them. They've not met a partner. They really want to meet a partner, and this buys them some time. And so I thought it was incredible as a company that we were providing financial support to do that for women who wanted it, right? But it was a good reminder that, like, journalists can fight. So, like, just thinking about, to your point, like, the angles, some Australian journalists are very cynical about companies offering some of these benefits, which we learned in this time doing that, right? Like, we thought they were kind of cool and we didn't. And so it was just a really interesting, but I think that's kind of comes back to this idea of the nature of journalists in different markets.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that wasn't a common thing for companies to be doing at the time in Australia. It was quite uncommon that was a benefit that we were providing. And it was just didn't cross our mind that was going to be the talk track of some of this stuff. So it's just a good reminder. Even as an Australian, I didn't think that was going to happen. But yeah, the nature of journalists in different markets can be very different, right? On different stories that you think are good stories.
So in the same kind of tangent of managing executives, how do you manage executives overseas? Say you're at headquarters and you don't have an in-house or an agency person on the ground in region. What does that management look like from your perspective? And what does good look like? What does bad?
Yeah. I mean, in a perfect world, I don't think we should be managing executives from far away. But it does happen, right? I've done it. I've sat in Australia and managed the Asia Pacific region. Before I had people, I had to manage those execs. Yeah. So I'm kind of like, beautiful vision is we don't do that. But to your question, if we have to do that, what does good look like and what does bad look like? I think it comes back to the same principles, right? Like, do you understand their world, their context, their customers, showing them that you have done that due diligence to understand that? So like a couple of tips from my perspective would be, and it sounds super obvious, but read the media a lot from that market. And even if you've got, like just a handful that you kind of go to, but just understanding what's going on in that any given week in that market at a high level around your industry. Because I would always want to get on the phone with an executive and demonstrate that I saw a big announcement that maybe a competitor made in that market. Like, just that market knowledge. So read the media. I think the second one is, if you've got a government affairs person in that market, or a public policy, whatever you want to call them, like, understanding the political landscape, what does that look like? The legislation around our industry. Lots of companies, are impacted by legislation in different markets. So understanding, like, where we sat with any of that type of stuff. And this is really, like, if I'm going back to early days, it was like, some markets were really anti-cloud and were kind of really behind the eight ball in terms of, like, even accepting cloud computing. So understanding where governments were at around that and whether we were trying to push an agenda around that or whatever it might be. So I think if you have someone like that, great. Otherwise, do your own learning. Spend time with that executive. Like, even if you don't have a reason, like an interview, like a quarterly catch up to understand their business, One thing we used to do that I think worked really well is we used to join forecast calls with that executive and their team, their sales team, just as a listener. But I think understanding where the business is going, what deals were coming up, what customers were in the pipeline really helps you get a head around their business, but also gives you some insight into what customers you might be able to announce deals and that sort of thing. Not every executive is going to be comfortable with that, but if you can build that relationship and join some of their meetings that are not about comms, I think that's a really helpful thing to do.
When managing an executive, you need to understand their world, which means that you need to understand the teams that they work with. And so that doesn't mean like knowing that, oh, they overlook sales and they overlook, these different areas of the business. It means understanding who their leadership team is and building a relationship with the people on that leadership team, and understanding maybe it's the local marketing person, maybe it's their local sales leader, maybe it's their government affairs person, maybe it's their CSM team, and having meetings with them and understanding like what are the struggles of the business, what's top of mind for this executive, like what are your conversations sounding like, and then that way you almost build your own little gang of that executive's leadership team around them so that you can get that support and build that relevance into whatever you're talking about.
The other thing, if you do get to the tipping point where you have money for an agency but you can't hire an in-house person, try and find an agency where there's someone where you go, I would feel really comfortable with that person hosting my executives interviews. Mm-hmm. I've often done that where I've sought out not just the agency, but particular talent at an agency who I go, that's almost like my second. And until I get an in-house person, I want that person to almost be that level of trust where I go, if I had an executive going to an in-person interview, they could host it and I would feel super comfortable that they had it under control. Yeah. So that would be the other thing I used to look for until I got someone in-house, was like, if I can't be there, who can I have do that? Obviously a lot of interviews these days now are phone and video and that sort of thing, but like, there are some in-person things that are invaluable for executives to do with journalists. And I think if you have that person, that's really important. And then I do think it goes back to what I said about teams, is like, if you can get to their market and visit and spend time with them and their team, I think it goes a long way to show your commitment to learning the market and that you are committed to and understanding that it is different to where maybe you grew up or what you're doing in the market you're in right now. So I think just that commitment is really important. So like, if you're going for something else and you don't have anything, again, like, don't wait to have an opportunity, like book time with the executive and just have a catch up, take them for lunch or a coffee or whatever it might be. I think if you're going to be in the market, spend time with them regardless of if there's an opportunity to do so, and make friends with all the EAs.
Yeah, make friends with their EAs.
That's a general rule. Yeah. That's like general rule in life is like, EAs are incredible. Like, just a shout out to the EA community. I don't think they get enough credit for how much they kind of keep a business moving and running, but like really invest in those relationships, and not in a fake way, in a real way. Like, who are they? What do they care about? That has paid dividends for me many, many, many times, of like managing to squeeze into calendars or making time when I'm in the city to visit, like all of that sort of stuff. So that's
when I first entered the job market, my dad told me, he was like, this is the most important advice that I can give you. You need to immediately make friends with the EAs, and you need to immediately make friends with your IT guy.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. But yeah, I think those tips I would offer.
Yeah. And going back onto the agency thing quickly as well, because you just reminded me of something. So when you're thinking about what that agency team looks like and you start to interview and you start to kind of do those RFPs, make sure that they have a specialist that suits what you're looking for in the market. So if there's not going to be a lot of national news or anything like that, make sure they're really good on trades. If you have somebody that you want to be strategic guidance, really find that one fit that is going to be your lifeline into the agency. I know, shout out to Neely, when we had her, she was amazing. And I was always, after Neely moved on to another agency, I was always like, I just need another Neely. I need my lifeline. Like, I need her.
My other tip for agency hiring is like, hire for cultural fit too. And what I mean by that is with you and your team, right? Like, so I always like to meet with the MDs or the whoever's kind of running the agency. And it's not about like, can they do the job? It's about like, how do they run their team? How do they avoid conflict or issues between, you know, the client and the agency? What's their team culture like? And, you know, we've had some incredibly long-standing agency relationships when I was at Salesforce. A lot of them are still part of my sort of inner circle in terms of like people I call and talk to. And like an agency can truly be an extension of your team, and you should treat them as such, right? That's my big belief, is they are not just a service provider to you. I think if you want success in a market and you're not there, treating them like they're a team, right? Those are young talent that you can also nurture, right? And that they want to learn. And I know when I was at agency, I would have loved a client to spend a bit more time with me or invest a little bit. So hopefully, like, I've tried to do that. You can't always do it. It's not always possible, but I have tried to do that. And in most of our markets, we had long-standing agency relationships. Of course, you have to change every now and then, but in general, I tried to find an agency that felt like us, and then therefore, you know, would work well with us.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Now that we've kind of talked about all of these things, what are some of the best practices for working at HQ and coordinating with international teams? And then vice versa. What are best practices if you're on the international team coordinating with HQ? Go.
I'll do from an international team coordinating with HQ, and maybe you talk about HQ with international.
Okay, I'll try to remember that. I've just been given that assignment.
Okay, so here are my top tips or best practices. The first one goes across this whole conversation that we've talked about, which is relationships. So I think if you're in a region, making sure you understand who are the different people at HQ that run maybe the different product PR teams, or who's got corporate, understanding who they are. So if you do get a chance to go to HQ for any reason, spending time with each of them, building those relationships. I think that's really important. And again, I say, even if you don't have a reason to catch up with them, I used to do quite frequent quarterly catch-ups with different parts of the HQ team just to stay connected to what was going on and all of that sort of stuff. HQ really is the heartbeat of the company. And I think we miss a lot of that in region. And I think it is a hard place to work sometimes at HQ. So having that empathy for what their role is as well. But that all comes down to relationships. So that's kind of my big tip, is like, build those relationships. The second one that I think for a regional team, and I used to say this to my team a lot, is like, no surprises. And that's a principle of my own teams as well. I don't care if there's something bad. I just don't want to be surprised by it. And I think that's to some extent what HQ is worried about, is something that they're not engaged on, they didn't know was coming, and then it crosses the CEO's desk before they knew about it, right? Which happens. So, you know, that gut check, or that like no surprises approach, was something I really did take. Is like, if I didn't quite know if something was right, I always checked, even if I felt a bit silly checking. It's like that sense of saying to, and it would be to like either my leader or someone senior in the HQ team, but saying, hey, this came across our desk. It feels like a good interview, but like, this could be the pitfall. We're not really sure. Here's the journalist. Are we talking about this at a global level? Are you seeing traction on this issue? Whatever it might be, right? And just getting a sounding board. And, you know, I don't know, 50% of the time it would be like, yeah, we're doing that too. Here's some messaging you can use. Yes, that's fine. The other 50%, they would be like, oh, actually, we've just had an anonymous, you know, email from this person, and we're a bit worried that there's going to be this story in Business Insider, and actually we don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
And me just checking that, I think, was really valuable. So I think that no surprises, if you're unsure, check with HQ, because you just don't want them seeing something that that they haven't been engaged on. So that's number 2. And then number 3, I think, is being strong where you need to push back for your market and having the strength to do so. And I think you need to really trust in yourself that you know what's right for your market. You know your journalists. If something isn't going to work, or you need to tweak it, or you need more data, or whatever it might be, then really having that conversation and that dialogue with HQ and being strong on that, because that's why they've hired you. Like, that's why the local business needs you. You're there to make sure the story is relevant for insert country, Australia, Singapore, India, whatever it might be. So those are kind of my 3, I think. And the third one can only be done if you have the relationships and you've given them no surprises before. So I think it's like they're all intertwined.
Yeah. I think the relationships goes both ways. So from the HQ to the regional perspective. So making sure that you not only know who is running individual markets and that you have that actual relationship with them, but you have a regular touch base with them. You try to understand, what do you need in your region to be successful? Like if there even is a lack of an executive presence, say from the technology side, they've got a GM in market, but they don't have a tech specialist. How can I help provide you with what you need to be successful in your storytelling and drive that market forward? The second piece for me is really letting go of needing to control and templatizing all of the messaging. So we've heard in a previous interview, we had somebody on who was a spokesperson in market, and she said one of the things that really just didn't work for me was that they wanted me to speak a certain way and talk about certain examples that just didn't resonate, and I just couldn't do it well, so it wasn't worth doing as the CEO of this business. And so really being flexible in understanding, and that comes back to the relationship as well of, here's what we're trying to do with this global launch, and then asking the question, what is resonating in your market right now? What do you need to localize? So what can we give you from a messaging perspective, but then also letting them take that and turn it into something that makes sense in their country or in their market. I think that's a big one as well. And just having that trust really, and just building that relationship with them so that they can do their magic locally.
Yeah. And then my PSA for like big comms teams, like global comms teams, I think where you could do, so one of the things I've always thought would be valuable for people would be to do like little secondments. So you to some extent did one, but did one off your own bat, right? Where you came out to Australia, spent some time with us, then learned about our market, and then you went back to HQ. And having you back at HQ, I just knew you were saying all the things that we had been saying for years, but in that environment, which was so helpful. And I just don't think we do enough of that cross-cultural learning where someone from HQ could spend time in a region and vice versa, region at HQ, because I do think HQ is a really tough job too. And so I don't know that all of that costs money, right? And so it's how much do you want to invest in your talent to really become a truly global team who understand different markets, different cultures, the way in which people operate. Like, I do think that's an investment that will pay off lots, but I just think it's hard for people to envision. And we used to do it a bit more in the early days, I think, when, maybe money was a little bit easier to come by. But, we also were a much smaller team. So when we had like a big event in Sydney, we often had to rely on HQ people to come and help because we didn't have the arms and legs to do it. And I cannot tell you the relationships that formed from that. And, I'm going to tell a funny story because we're going to have her on the pod. So I'm going to tell a story about when I ran India. And I had no one on the ground. I had an agency, but no in-house person. And we were launching our office in Hyderabad, which is now one of our largest offices globally. But at the time, we didn't have one, and we were launching it. And so I think this story is a good one for this topic because I had to rely very heavily on my agency and trust in how we were going to do an office launch in India and what that looked like, right? And the things that maybe I would do here, I wouldn't necessarily do there, and vice versa. I had a great agency at the time. They were fantastic. And so, I was relying on them a lot. But at the time, we also had a HQ real estate lead. And her name is Cheryl. Well, she's not there anymore, but she was the real estate lead. And Cheryl and I had been working on this because she kind of owned the overall real estate narrative. We were opening this new big office, and then I owned the region. And so we partnered really closely in the lead up to this event. And, I was going over for the launch, and we had executives coming from HQ and local executives. And, to my surprise, she said, "I'm coming too." And, that was a long way to go for a HQ person. And, some people could have viewed that as HQ coming to make sure we did a good job. But Cheryl never made it feel like that. It was like, we're in this together. You and I are doing this. We're kind of running it ourselves. This is a big deal. I'm going to come. And so we go over to India and we're meeting there. And so I fly in, she flies in, she got in first. And the next morning we're having breakfast and she arrived and she had her husband with her. Well, that's unusual, but okay. And shout out to Josh, he's a lovely man. So he joined us for breakfast. And the whole time I'm thinking, this is a bit weird. Like, I didn't bring my partner. And then I thought, well, no, she's traveled to a new country. Maybe she was nervous. Like, I'm not going to judge. You know, I'm just going to keep anyway. And then quite early into the breakfast, and keep in mind, I don't think at this point, I think we'd met maybe once in person, but Cheryl leans over to me and says, "You're probably thinking it's really weird I've got my husband here." And I was like, no, like, it's all good. And then she said, "Oh, no, I need to explain." She said, "I'm pregnant with my first baby and I'm only 8 weeks along." And I was like, oh, and she was like, "I was just really anxious. I didn't want to let you down." And I was like, "You didn't need to come." Like, and she's like, "No, we'd agreed on this. We were going to run it together." And I think, that trip for her was a big eye opener in terms of how we do things in India and what that was like. And I think it was a great learning for her to take back to HQ to talk about global real estate, what that looks like. But it also formed a really strong relationship between the two of us. And she could have easily pulled out of that trip and she didn't. And we have been firm friends ever since and have supported each other many, many times. And I have a very special place in my heart for Matteo, her firstborn son, because he was on our India trip with us. But yeah, it was just a really good example of like two regional HQ just working together, doing it ourselves, and just really working well together, but also having this opportunity to build a relationship that was beyond what we were actually doing. It was like,
Totally.
and like this woman was anxious and, and she still came and still supported. So just, I thought that was a good example of like building a relationship and also just, a funny story.
A real cute one. Yeah, no, it's great. I think also when you know someone then understands the market, they go to bat for you when you're not 100%. There.
Yep.
I love that. Okay, well, do you want to wrap up and do Dumb in Private?
Yeah, let's do it. I feel like you have a good one this week.
I do have a good one this week. So I know that you guys listening, but you can check it out once we launch our YouTube channel. But we've got microphones, people. The microphones are in front of our mouths. Sometimes they are there in like pure camera shot. Sometimes they're far away. I do all the editing for the podcast, and I experimented with our last episode, and I had a specialist like go and kind of go through the audio and fix everything for me. And in the video that he was editing, he goes, "Well, I know why you're having a hard time with your microphone." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Because it's upside down." And so I had been going to a specialist because I just couldn't get the audio right. And I was so upset about it. And I was like, "What is wrong with me?" And it's because my microphone has been down since episode 1 and I've not been using it correctly.
Poison. I enjoy that we got microphone tips from him. Like he really was like, "You two need some help." So,
unsolicited too. He was like, "First and foremostly, let me give you some tips."
Not his job, but sort of his job. But it was very, very forthright. So I enjoyed his tips. I have taken them to heart. I'm really working on my microphone positioning.
Your etiquette.
Etiquette and positioning. Oh my gosh, that's a good one. I only have a silly one this week, and I feel like all of mine revolve around my kids lately, but that's the story of my life. I've just realized like how much gaps in my general knowledge I have. So like my 4-year-old is like very inquisitive at the moment and very curious. And we do this thing at night where we like, he calls it talk about, but it's basically when he's going to sleep, we talk about something and he picks it.
That's really cute.
It's cute. But like sometimes he picks really random shit that I don't know about, like space and like the dinosaurs and like all this stuff where I have like a general overview, which seems to satisfy most of the time, but sometimes he goes deep. Like he said to me, we're talking about crocodiles, and I was saying how they're quite prehistoric and they've been around for thousands of years and they're still here and blah, blah, blah. And then he was like, "Well, how come they survived and not the dinosaurs?" And I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. So I just have to keep saying, "That's a really good question to ask, Dad." And then hopefully Andrew will fill in the gaps at some point. So yeah, that's just my Dumb in Private is like, I really should have paid more attention in school. It's some of the things that are kind of vital pieces of knowledge,
I did a TikTok quiz the other day that was like, can you get to 8th grade science? And it asked you a question from kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade. And I got to about 6th grade, which is really embarrassing because I actually started my college degree as a biology major. Which is why
you didn't finish that.
It's why I'm here now, folks.
Same. Like,
I'm a words person.
Same. Like, don't, and I am horrified to think, and like, please write in anyone who's got school age kids. Like, what happens when I'm going to be lost with maths. Like I'm
I was
just
going to say, at what year are you?
kids? You don't want to be like, who doesn't know how to do it? Look, luckily I married someone with the opposite brain to me. I feel like we are opposites in that way. Like he's very logical. He's good at maths. I'm like, you take the wheel, my friend, and I'll take English.
Yes, exactly.
The two of us will figure it out.
Oh my God, I love it.
Yeah, that's mine.
Oh, good job in privates this week. Let's keep it up.
Congratulating ourselves for these. I feel like that's like, we're like, yay, we're not so much.
We're so humble. Let's humanize ourselves. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you want us to cover a topic, please reach out. You can email us at hello@smartinpublicpod.com. We're also on Instagram and TikTok under Smart in Public Pod. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Please rate, review, and subscribe. And we will chat to you next week.
See you later.
Okay, bye.